In the previous lesson, we graphed the graph of sine x. Now I'm going to graph the graph of cosine x. We'll do it the same exact way as before. I'm going to plot some points, and then we'll just connect the dots and see what kind of graph we get. All right, so let's go ahead and make another table. We'll randomly choose some x values, and we'll figure out what the corresponding cosine of those x values are. And we'll start with 0. Remember, the cosine of 0 is 1. Okay. I'll choose pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves. Okay, these are all points on the unit circle, so these are pretty easy to evaluate. Remember the cosine of pi halves. What was that one? That was 0. Okay. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi halves is 0. And the cosine of 2 pi is 1. All right, so I'm going to plot the point 0, 1, pi halves, 0, pi, -1, etc. All right, so let's plot these points and see what we get. 0, 1. There's the first point, right there. Next point was pi halves, 0. So pi halves, 0 is there. Next point was pi, -1. Pi, -1. Next point was 3 pi halves and 0. The last point was 2 pi, 1. Okay. Now, certainly I could have plotted a lot more points, but I think you get the idea. So the cosine function looks something like this. Okay. Now we could have made some negative values over here, and we're going to get the same shape. And it's going to go on, of course, forever and ever. And there is the cosine function. Looks a little bit like the sine function, except remember the sine function started with a at 0, 0 here. The cosine started at 0, 1. Okay, it's really the only difference. It's just a little bit shifted. Now, what's the domain? Well, obviously the domain is all real numbers. Okay, just like the sine function. And the range again is going to range from -1 to 1. Remember, range are y values, domain x values. So the domain of the cosine function is all real numbers. The range is -1 to 1. And again, all we did was we just plotted some points. We'll take a look at a little better graph of cosine x. Again, I went ahead and graphed this on a graphing calculator for you. But notice when x is 0, we have a y-intercept of 1. We have x-intercepts at increments of pi halves, actually odd increments of pi halves. Pi halves, 3 pi halves. We'll have another x-intercept at 5 pi halves, 7 pi halves, 9 pi halves, etc. Here's negative pi halves. We have an x-intercept. Another one at -3 pi halves, etc. Okay? And the range, of course, is -1 to 1, and the domain is all real numbers. So far, you have to be able to graph sine x. Okay? It's got to be off the top of your head, and you've got to be able to graph the graph of cosine x. The next lesson we will do is the graph of tangent x. Okay?